a lot of people are reluctant to have project management in their organization because it's completely overhead.
Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Chrysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business.
Hey everybody, so excited to be welcoming back Angela Thurman today. Angela is a certified project management professional and the owner of Thurman Co, a management consulting firm based out of Houston, Texas. Angela, I am so excited to have you back on the podcast. Welcome back to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast.
Thanks, David. Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so we had a really great conversation in general about project management, and I'm excited to kind of dive into this topic a little bit further with you. And really the question that's been posed is, when it comes to project management, where does it belong? Does it belong in operations? Does it belong in product development? What bucket should we be putting in project management? So I'd love to hear from you. I definitely have my own opinion on it, but I'd love to hear from you kind of at a high level, what you think about that question in general, and then we'll kind of dive in a little bit deeper.
Sure. So I have my preference, and there are definitely pros and cons to having it in either operations or in product development or business development, probably. But you will see it very frequently in operations. I don't really know why. I think that a lot of companies think of project management and having it in the whole planning cycle with sales and having it with like the fulfillment cycle. And you will see it there. And I've experienced that in my career.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, to your point, you see it in a lot of different areas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it belongs at certain points in time. I think it belongs in all of those areas. Yes. Because, where you can utilize the talents of people like yourselves that have gone through the, certifications and the training of it, it can really be utilized to develop a much deeper planning cycle that ultimately then impacts, if we're going to talk about operations, it's going to then impact the people, process, technology. If we're talking about the product development, then it's going to impact the people, process, and technology. Mm-hmm. And that's why I like about it, because it's, it can be utilized throughout the operation. And I do believe that there is a lot of crossover, between functionality. So what do you say to people that want to draw that hard line of it doesn't belong in operations management, because that is really an ongoing if you will, kind of project management or project planning. It's a daily occurrence. What do you say to somebody that kind of has that perspective?
Well, you're right, because by definition, a project is a temporary occurrence. It has a start and a finish. And so you may not want that in your operations group. And a lot of people are reluctant to have project management in their organization because it's completely overhead. And they're like, I don't want that under my budget because I don't want to pay for it. And there's a lot to be said for that. Ideally, you would have a freestanding, independent project management office that has its own budget and is, not under the control of some other larger organization, and where those resources are supporting all of these different divisions, but they're independent of those organizations. That's a little bit difficult to envision, I think, for most organizations, if you've got a matrixed organization, it becomes a little bit easier. But where you've got a very strong hierarchy type organization, it's difficult to find the right spot for your project managers. And what you'll end up having is siloed groups with a few project managers over here in engineering, a few project managers in business development, a few project managers in operations. And those project managers aren't talking to each other, and they're not necessarily using the same resources. They're not typically following the same structures, or they're not using the same tools, they're not using the same methods, and that can get a company into some trouble. And it's better when all the project managers are friendly, and they're relying on one another, and they're helping one another, and they're using the same sets of tools.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And I like what you said in there about organizations maybe having the ability to outsource that component, project management, because again, I agree with what you said in terms of a lot of businesses probably can't wrap their head around how would we leverage a full-time resource in project management, let alone multiple resources there. And I think some of that comes down to education, right? Because when I think about somebody that has that type of expertise, that has your expertise, there's so many different aspects, kind of back to how we open this conversation. To me, there's so many different aspects and types of projects that you can have input on that ultimately, again, impact what we're trying to impact, right? Like profitability in the long run, right? But to get to that, okay, to avoid error, to avoid cost, to increase profitability, to get to all of that, right? We have to do planning, people, process, technology, right? That's how I break down business systems, because that's why there's, to me, such a crossover and such a link to what we're talking about here. But I do think it's challenging for a lot of organizations to kind of wrap their head around what exactly do you do and how exactly is that going to help me, impact profitability.
Exactly. So someone asked me about, what do I do and how did I get to where I am today? And I told her, I said, well, part of what makes me good at what I do today is that, even from childhood, I played chess. And so, yes, I'm making this move, but I'm looking 3 moves ahead. And so I'm thinking about the consequences of this move, right? And as a project manager, you kind of have to have that chess mentality, because you're always looking for the risks and the dependencies and those sorts of things. And it's it can be a house of cards, right? Your project. And so you want to always be looking ahead and planning ahead. And if this happens, what else might happen? And if this doesn't happen, what might happen? And it's always that what if kind of game. So that's where, if you have an independent PMO, you're going to be involving all of your stakeholders. So not just my own immediate group, but all of those other groups and organizations that might be touched or affected by whatever change you're implementing. Because whatever your project is, it's going to bring about some kind of change. You're implementing a new process, you're developing a new product, you're looking for a new supplier. Whatever it is, you wouldn't be doing this if you weren't going to be introducing some sort of change. So you want to make sure that everyone that is going to be affected is informed and on board and ready to support this project.
Yeah, it's a great perspective. And I think getting back to what we were saying in terms of how organizations can leverage,
Yes.
people with this skill set, it's really
Mhm.
understanding how many, departments, people, vendor, how many things that you guys ultimately touch throughout one of these project cycles,
Mhm.
and kind of getting in this mindset of looking at some of the initiatives through a project lens, where sometimes, I'd love to get your takeaway on this because I can only speak from my experience, but sometimes I think in especially larger organizations, right, and definitely in the SMB space as well, but the
Mhm.
bigger the organization, kind of more challenges I find that this entails. But it's kind of that, you know, these projects don't really get put into a project bucket. They kind of get in and shifted into people's just daily responsibilities. And before you know it, there's kind of like, we talk about scope creep, right? From
Mhm. Yep.
a consulting perspective,
Mhm.
or project perspective. But I kind of, equate that terminology to what I'm talking about, where things kind of just get shoved on people and additional responsibilities. Oh, Susie, she's got plenty of time. Let's give her this to deal with. And before you know it, you're paying people for these types of project management tasks. Yet what you're really doing from a business perspective is you are not utilizing the resources that you have for what they were intended for. And you're kind of, muddying the waters there. So I'd love to get your perspective on that.
That's true. That's very true. One thing that just immediately sprung to mind for me is those sort of incidental scope creep that you didn't even realize was going to happen because you simply didn't understand what might be affected. So, in my former role as a subcontracts program manager in the aerospace industry, I was responsible for both the data management unit and the printer, the flight deck printer for the 747-8, the Boeing 747-8, which was the aircraft that was capable of carrying the most cargo of any aircraft in the world. And in fact, it was the first aircraft that was capable of carrying 1 million pounds of cargo. So obviously at 1 million pounds, you've got an additional digit in that number. So it was the first time we'd gotten to that many digits. It was almost like Y2K, right? You've got suddenly this additional digit. And not everyone had thought about what that might affect. So the data management unit, which processes just every kind of data input you can imagine, it's like the brain of the aircraft. It's getting all of these inputs, processing all this information, and it generates reports of just everything you can imagine. One of those being the cargo. And so we had to go back to the manufacturer of that device and say, oh, we have to update the software to allow for this additional digit. And that was a software update that had not been considered in the past leading up to this. And then we also had to consider, does the printer allow for this many digits? Can we run reports of all the cargo? And so we had to do both of those things. And luckily, of course, everything was okay, but it was a risk that we had to offset. So
yeah, what a great example though, just from the standpoint of again, you don't know what you don't know
Exactly.
until you start to get into some of these things. And again, when you really take a look at it from a high level, I get back to the collective brain power idea, right? And I'm always
Mhm.
talking about this because it it really touches so many different things.
Mhm.
And I think in general, we need to figure out ways to simplify the things that we are doing, whether we're talking about from a project management standpoint, specific processes within, kind of the project we're looking at, how those, ultimate relate to the entire system, how we talk about all these things, right? And I really
Mhm.
feel like the only way to get through all of those things is by engaging people and engaging the right people, not just
Mhm.
bringing a bunch of people together, but really looking for resources that are going to help you, move the needle. And
Yes.
again, when I get back to it and thinking about, how could a company take advantage of, outsourcing some of these initiatives that they have.
Mhm.
I think what you said earlier is a great way to look at it from the standpoint of, again, you know, let's keep the resources doing, that we already have, doing what they're the best at. I used
Mhm.
to go into print manufacturing. I have a long-standing history in print manufacturing, and I can't tell you the number of organizations that I would go into where I would see somebody from the front office, let's say, who's responsible for sales, out
Mhm.
in the shop, putting together a hand assembly piece or something like that. And
Uh-huh.
just, inevitably start asking questions, right? And it's like, well, why do you have, Susie out here doing, well, we have this hot job. It's got to get out. We got to get it done. It's like, yeah, but on the other side of that, what is Susie responsible for that she's not able to get done? And I think this is the same type of a situation where the conversation needs to be more around, not just does project management belong in operations? Does it belong in product development? Does it belong somewhere very specific?
Mhm.
Versus looking at how do we leverage that as a resource to impact this initiative that we have. We have an initiative to
Mhm.
maybe implement a new ERP. We have an
Mhm.
initiative to reduce inventory spend. We have an initiative to fill in the blank. So
Mhm. Mhm. So those are all good questions. I think that one thing is you want to always start by looking at your lessons learned. So, does the company have any lessons learned that they've captured from similar activities in the past? Because you don't want to, repeat um, mistakes that you've made in the past. And why reinvent the wheel? So, that would be one thing to do. And then you're absolutely right. You want the people who are in place to continue to do the things that they are best at. And you actually don't gain anything by moving someone who's an excellent salesperson out to the manufacturing floor to try and get out a hot job because they don't know what they're doing and they're actually going to help. They're going to delay the process because they don't know what they're doing. Um, and I think that that's a mistake. And but that's my opinion. Um, I think that you probably have some resources internally that maybe are getting stuck or assigned to doing project management. I see that a lot. And a lot of people are getting stuck with the title project manager or some type of project title when they have no idea what real project management is. And that's unfortunate because it's really doing them a disservice. Um, they likely are not very successful in the role and probably because they're not properly trained. I see, and this just kind of burns me up a little bit when I see all these ads on TV or on the web, where it's like, become a project manager in 6 weeks. And I'm like, really? Maybe you can take a great course.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful. That's a great foundation. But to be effective, you have to have some skin in the game. You have to have a little bit of experience. And so I would definitely recommend taking the courses, but unless you've had a little, I mean, you can't even sit for the PMP until you've had like 6 years of experience. So I don't know exactly at what point you can begin to call yourself a project manager.
But it's challenging, I think, too, from that standpoint, because again, I look at it from an organization's perspective, and people that get those types of responsibilities kind of by default, and in some cases it's not by default, right? It's they're actively going out and hiring people for these roles that maybe aren't qualified. Maybe they're, from a company perspective, they don't have the budget to bring in a certified PMP. But what happens, I feel like, is when people that are in those types of roles that don't understand fully the scope and understand what kind of impact they could really have, because they lack some of that experience or the certification itself, it kind of is twofold, right? The business then kind of says it reinforces the case of, well, see, we don't really need, we're not really getting what we're paying for with a junior person that doesn't really understand how to impact this project or how to impact, this initiative. So it kind of reinforces the bad. I mean, do you find that as well when you end up coming across, kind of these situations where they're shoehorning, unfortunate souls into this role?
Yes.
That are, because I feel like it's kind of like, the operations consultant, like, there's, when you've lived through some real ugly situations,
Exactly.
you get to understand a little bit about what it takes, and to your point earlier, how to foresee, how to look into the future and figure out, well, I better plug a hole over here and plug a hole over here. But do you find that in those situations, those companies have kind of really handcuffed themselves, and that it's reinforcing like their own narrative about their perceptions of project management, or do you see something different?
I think that it does. And unfortunately, it gives the whole project management group a bad reputation, because people will say, oh, well, the projects are always late, they're always over budget, they never fully meet the requirements. And what can one say but, well, yeah, because your project managers are not really project managers. They're salespeople that you forced to lead this project, or they're engineers that you took away from systems or R&D or whatever the case may be, and made them lead this project. So that's, that is unfortunate. Yeah. Whereas if you have someone that has taken some serious project management training and understands how all of these aspects work together, they understand why you have to have a project charter, and why you have to have a project plan, why you need a risk register, why you need an action item register, how to conduct a cadence meeting, those sorts of things, then you're more likely to come to a positive outcome.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, the one thing that kind of jumped into my mind, because as you were walking through that, is, so often we can look at and talk about, well, technology, kind of being the savior of things. And so often right? People look to technology and implementing technology to be the answer, right? Because
Right.
it's seemingly on the surface, it's the easiest thing to kind of measure, right? I know the
Mhm.
software is going to cost me X. It has the ability to impact, Y, and there's my ROI. And so the one thing that jumped into my mind with what you were saying is, you can't just buy a license to Microsoft Project and call yourself, a project management professional. So, there's tools within that tool that, a lot of people, I would argue, even the best project managers don't always know how to leverage. And so the technology is just, what it is. It's a tool. That's
Microsoft
why.
Project is not going to make any of those things I just said.
Well, I was something I had to throw out there because I
It
know
is.
so often, people think about those types of things and say, oh, well, this is really all I need to manage this entire initiative.
Uh-huh.
And again, we've got some mutual good friends who run into similar things with Microsoft Excel, and people trying to do advanced planning with tools like that. So the thought process behind technology being
Yes.
the answer in these situations is it is what it is. It is a tool to be
Yes.
leveraged when you have the other correct resources, which are really the people, the process, the planning aspect is what you're executing against. So Angela, as we kind of get ready to wind this down, is there anything else that you want to share when it comes to kind of this question of, where does project management belong, or how project management should be looked at from an organization perspective to kind of best leverage, internal resources and external resources?
Wherever the organization decides to put their project managers, I would recommend that those project managers be engaged as early as possible. So if it's possible, you want to get them involved as soon as the idea for the project bubbles to the surface, so that they can begin to get involved with the other stakeholders, but particularly with the project sponsor, because the project manager is responsible for creating the project charter. And this is where you outline what is the purpose of the project, who's going to pay for this project. And that's where you literally get that sponsor to sign the document that says, okay, this is what we all agree to, and this is the budget. This is the limits of my authority, and yea, verily, sign right here. And if you can get that as early in the project as possible, you'll be really set up for success. Because if you come in late in the game and engineering has already decided what the design's going to be, and someone's already decided who the parts are going to be purchased from, there's not a lot that the project manager can influence. And that could be detrimental.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. For anybody that wants to be able to reach you directly, where's the best place for them to get a hold of you at?
So you can reach me on LinkedIn. We have a Thurman Co. LinkedIn profile. And then, of course, my website is thurmanco.com.
Perfect. And I'll make sure to put those both into the show notes. Oh, Angela, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems podcast. It's been awesome to have you back, and look forward to the next conversation.
Of course. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Chrysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Chrysler.